Ashley Lombardo.
Join the meeting.
All right, everybody. Welcome, everybody. Very happy to have you all here. Of course, right when I unmuted, that's when an airplane decided to fly over my house. So I hope nobody heard that, but that's how that goes. And speaking of that, I'm going to ask everybody will be muted. You can use the raise hand function if you want to. Hello, Robin, how are you? If you have a question, but we're going to move through this, and please take advantage of the chat feature as well. So without further ado, I want to welcome you all to our school avoidance training. It's really great to see so many people here and so many people really engaged in this topic. Today we have a wonderful trainer, highly experienced and just an awesome woman. And this is Dr. Jennifer Powell-Lunder. And Dr. Lunder is a clinical psychologist, and she specializes in work with tweens, teens, young adults, adults, and families. She's also the co-author of a book, Teenage as a Second Language. I have dropped the title of that book into the chat. It would be at the very top of the chat. She's also a featured blogger on tweens for Psychology Today. I have also dropped the link to Psychology Today in the chat as well. Dr. Powell is also regularly featured both nationally and internationally through the media as an expert in her field. She's a published researcher, she's a writer, She's an accomplished speaker and a consultant on these issues that are facing families, tweens, and teens and young adults. And she's an adjunct professor of psychology at Pace University. So Dr. Lunder has a wealth of experience, and I want to welcome her. Jennifer.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I guess I'll jump right in. I'm going to share my screen with all of you, and we're going to get going. So today we're going to talk about school refusals. Sometimes we call it school avoidance. And what's interesting is I've given this presentation on numerous occasions, but I've never given it during the time of COVID. So we're definitely going to get into some of the impact that COVID has had on this issue. I'm especially concerned when we're now in such non-traditional schooling circumstances that I think that all this information is going to be quite pertinent once our kids, hopefully keeping fingers and toes crossed, get back to a more traditional setting in school in the near future. Unfortunately, with that, there's a lot of concern that the incidences of school avoidance will increase. Just to give you a little more background on my experience with this topic. So I was over at Four Winds for many years. I ran their one of their inpatient adolescent units. But before that, I ran the child and adolescent partial program. And that's when I first became really acquainted with school refusal. We saw so many kids who came to the partial program, which was a 9 to 3 program. They did school with us. Because of the flexibility, we had an opportunity to kind of use it as a lab to figure out protocols that would work to getting the kids back to school. We were highly successful, so successful that we were starting to launch a quantitative research study. Unfortunately, that never came to fruition because then I moved to inpatient and it just never happened. But the point is that a lot of the information I have to share with you is based on my own experience with this topic. So we're going to jump right in. Oops, sorry about that. Okay. So we have to start with the definition. So what is school refusal, school avoidance? So it was first called school phobia in 1941, and today we know it as school refusal or school avoidance. And basically, it's defined as a child that doesn't fully attend school and has no reasonable or justifiable circumstances for the absence. The absence can be child or parent motivated. For example, requiring a child to stay home to babysit younger siblings or care for an elderly grandparent. The prevalence, believe it or not, is estimated to be between 2 to 5% of all school-age children have at one point refused school. And the incidence is similar between boys and girls, although school refusal ages occurs at all ages. It's more common in kids 5 to 6 than 10 to 11. It peaks at ages 5 to 6 and then at 14 to 15, but the mean age falls around 10 years old. The longer a child is out of school, it's no surprise, the harder it is to come back. And there really is no socioeconomic differences that have been noted regarding the prevalence rates. Although I do have to add in that during COVID, because of the technological requirements,
join the meeting.
Have seen an increase in COVID in kids from lower SES. And that research is currently being compiled actually as we speak. So what does change is the demographic.
You muted yourself.
No, you're fine. You're good.
No, she accidentally muted.
No, I think Kim, you may mute me, but that's okay. The children from lower SES tend to be more anxious or fearful about social aspects of school, teachers, and peers, whereas kids from higher SES are more anxious about like evaluative aspects of school, like grades, tests, etc. And school refusal is associated with separation anxiety, is linked more to females, whereas phobias are linked more to males. And we're definitely going to get into this as we talk more. Okay. So next we have to talk about chronic versus acute. So chronic school refusers have long histories of school non-attendance, sometimes spanning back to inconsistencies when they first started school. And when we get into prevention and intervention, we're going to talk a lot more about this. So here's the thing. A lot of the times we don't realize that a school refuser is a chronic school refuser because the handoff is non-existent from school to school. That can be because the child moved. So they come into a new school and the new school has no idea that the kids have been refusing school for this long. The worst case I've ever had is I've literally worked with kids who have been consistent school refusers throughout their entire school history, have not had one single year of full school. And yet this has never been highlighted. And this becomes really important when we talk about prevention. So acute school refusal is typically tied to distinct and sudden periods of school non-attendance. So often this is after a period of justifiable non-attendance. So for example, like a prolonged illness, and definitely during COVID, we're seeing a lot of kids who are suddenly demonstrating acute school refusal, which we're definitely going to get into in a little bit, meaning that kids who never had trouble going to school now are having trouble. So the next question is, who are likely to be our school refusers? What we want to look at is the common clinical comorbidities, because that way for prevention, we can highlight, some of the kids. So the first is looking at separation disorder. Obviously, the kids who have trouble separating from their parents definitely are at higher risk. Kids with general anxiety are garden variety neurotics, right? They definitely are more likely to experience school refusal. Certainly social anxiety disorder, for sure. Obsessive compulsive disorder, kids who have OCD are more likely to experience it, and specific phobia. So what we mean about a specific phobia is maybe a phobia related to something at the school or a specific reason why they can't leave home. What we're seeing a lot during COVID for sure is depression. Kids who become so unmotivated that they can't get up and do what they were responsible for doing as their daily task, which is obviously school. We know that for kids, school is their job. Also kids who have bipolar disorder and disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. For those of you who are not familiar with this is a newer diagnosis, and it's similar to bipolar disorder, but it's marked by extreme aggressive outbursts and tantrums. We also see kids on the autistic spectrum.
Join the meeting.
Comorbid, ADHD, learning disabilities, and just pausing for a second, with ADHD and learning disabilities, it makes a lot of sense that these kids have a rough time going to school. Why? Because school's harder for them. So again, we're going to talk so much about prevention today. We're also going to talk about intervention, but if we can get ahead of this and identify this stuff, it really makes a big difference on how you approach these kids to prevent them from becoming school refusers, because there really are so many red flags before we get to this point. Kids with oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. So next, what we want to ask ourselves is why? Why what are the main reasons why kids don't attend school? And actually, research has broken it down to 4 main categories. And as we go through these 4 main categories, I hope you'll see that when you think back on the individual cases of kids that you have, I want you to kind of think about, well, which category do these kids belong into? And I'm sure you'll realize that they really do fit into one of the 4, and sometimes overlapping into 1 or 2. So the first is the avoidant kids, and these are the kids who have separation anxiety, have phobias or general anxiety. These kids, the ones who have separation anxiety, have fears about leaving their parents, leaving their homes often. So it's not about something at the school necessarily, it's more about not being around their parents. And certainly we will see this avoidance can be sparked or triggered by if there's been trauma in the family, like a loss of a parent, grandparent, somebody close to the child. We see this a lot, especially with the loss of one parent. Then kids become afraid to go to school because they're afraid they're going to lose the other parent. Specific phobias also, that meaning that a kid kind of latches on to a thought that they can't get past, a specific fear about school or about leaving home, that makes it difficult for them to get there. And probably just general anxiety. Kids who are just generally anxious fall into the avoidance category. So the second category we've talked a lot about recently, right? Bullying. So obviously, if a kid is having social issues at school, they're not going to want to go there. Now, a lot of the times, this is not so obvious. So what I always recommend is that, and we're going to talk more about this as we get into intervention and prevention, we have to look to people who can give us information. So you always want to use multiple resources of information. For example, one of the best resources you will find regarding bullying is the bus driver. If a kid takes a bus, a lot of times teachers don't see it, and others, it's not obvious in school, but on the bus, it is obvious. So sometimes the people we don't think to talk to are really the ones that give us the best information. The lunch monitors, great resources of information. Because again, sometimes these are the people that are more silent in the background, and they really are the observers. So if you suspect bullying, but you can't put your finger on where it's happening, it could be the bus, or it could just be subtle. Social anxiety, just kids who, often kids who are shyer are really experiencing social anxiety. So they get too overstimulated when they go to school. So if it gets really bad, they get to the point of not going to school. And finally, peer or teacher issues, meaning that there's a specific peer that, or like peer groups, cliques, that they feel uncomfortable with, so they don't want to go. Maybe they feel like they're in the out group, or they don't fit in. Or if I've worked a lot with kids who have a teacher that for one reason or another they just don't connect with, so they just avoid school because of that teacher. And the reason it's so important to really get to the bottom of this is that if we know what the root is, obviously, then we can work to, work collaboratively with the child, the family, and the school to get them back to school. So the third type is reinforcement. So, I put gaming on here, and you may think I'm kidding, but I'm not. I have had, especially teenagers, remember Fortnite? Many kids are still playing it. I've literally had kids who refused to go to school and then played Fortnite all day at home. But I mean, really refused. It's not something like their parents could get them there. But they were so reinforced at being home that they didn't want to go to school. Same thing with Netflix, TV streaming. And obviously, we're going to talk about ways to get around this, because if they don't have access to this stuff, then certainly it's going to be easier to get them to school. Time with friends. I've had kids who stay home Snapchatting and TikToking all day while their friends are in school. Home is a stress-free environment. School may be really stressful for them, especially kids with learning issues. And what we're seeing during COVID is what I call cocooning. So in March, when we sent all our kids home, we were very worried about how the kids were going to react to being home. Well, I work with many kids who are anxious, and a lot of people thought that the anxious kids were going to have the hardest time, but actually many of them didn't. They did what I call cocooning, which is they got so settled into their home that they're so comfortable. They're like in their own cocoon. And it's made it really difficult to get them out.
Jennifer, can you pause for a minute?
Yeah.
I see somebody who keeps unmuting.
And also too, it'll help build your credit, and some lenders will give you a little discount on your interest rate. Maybe 0.25%. It doesn't seem like much. With loans as big as yours, for the life of the loan, we're talking thousands of dollars.
Jennifer, you should be able to mute everybody.
And I've got some really big news.
Yeah, everyone is muted. So,
right?
All right, let me look.
Wonderful. Hello. This is the thing. If you work in the public sector, you can have.
I found her. Okay, continue.
Okay. So reason 4 is attention from caregivers. So what does that mean? There are kids who are going to stay home because, especially kids from larger families, who if they stay home, they get special attention. So, because they can be the only one. So that really pulls for kids to stay home. In this category, we often see kids with somatic complaints, stomach aches, headaches. And I've worked with many families that have spent, years dragging their kids to doctors. They're trying to find what the root is, and nobody can find anything. And what we often figure out is that because they're getting that special attention, that's what pushes them to be home. And finally, in this category, we look at home responsibilities. So what that means is, and this can be one of two things. This can be parents who are more likely to allow their kids to stay home because they're so overwhelmed themselves that having a child stay home and help with the responsibilities at home, especially younger children, is very helpful. So I want to be clear. In most cases that I've worked with in this type of situation, it hasn't been a parent commanding the kid to stay home. It's more a subtle message that the child picks up from their parents that they're really overwhelmed and that it would be very helpful to have them around to help with the home responsibilities. On occasion, we do see a case where parents do keep kids home because they need them at home. Okay. But again, those cases are rarer than we think. Okay. So what about COVID? COVID has really redefined what it means to refuse school. And I'm going to go through the different categories that we're seeing. So the first type of school refusal we're seeing that's COVID specific is no show, meaning virtually or in person. And actually, a few weeks ago, some of you may have watched 60 Minutes. Actually, I had a piece on this, on kids that since school went virtual are just missing. Maybe they moved. Sometimes it's just that they didn't have access to the technology, but they just can't be found. And these kids were, many of them were consistently in school. And then when COVID hit, we just lost them. The next type of COVID specific form of refusal is no show virtually, meaning that they're supposed to be logging on and they're not there. But especially in hybrid situations, many times these kids will go to school, but they won't go to school on the days that they're supposed to be virtual, or asynchronous, meaning that they're supposed to be doing work and they're just not handing it in. And we're definitely seeing a lethargy that's set in for our kids. A kind of dysthymia, which is akin to depression. And we certainly see this with these kids that don't show up virtually. Often when kids don't show up virtually, it's because they have anxiety about being on video. Even with cameras off and muted, because they're afraid someone's going to ask them to, be present. So that's definitely been a major issue during COVID. The next type is we have no show in person. So this is the reverse. We have kids who are attending school virtually, but not in person. Now, the problem with this obviously is that if you're on a hybrid, you're assigned certain days when you're in school, as you guys know, and certain days when you're home. So these kids will show up to school, but if they come in on a day that they can't, because of, all the regulations, obviously, that they can't go to school. If they're not able to attend virtually for whatever reason, they can't just show up in the school won't let them in. So it's very important that we highlight each one of these categories, because then we can counteract it, make exceptions for kids so that they don't slip through the cracks. So for example, with a kid who's a no-show in person but will attend virtually, maybe it's good to give them a pass and say, okay, you can always attend virtually. Also we're having an issue with COVID with families who are understandably concerned about safety, especially if they have high-risk people in their homes. So I have many kids who have opted to be virtual consistently, and obviously every school I know of does offer this option to families. The big concern we have about these kids is what I put on the slide before, that they're cocooned, that they're set in, that what's gonna happen is next year when they have to go back to school, because they've been attending virtually for so long, that it's gonna be really hard. And I'm working with some kids that are thriving attending virtually, like doing better in school than they've ever done. And we're gonna kind of get into that later about, I think COVID has really redefined education for all of us in ways that we never even realized. For example, are there ever going to be snow days again, right? Because if there's a snow day now, as long as people have power and access to the internet, theoretically, they can go to school. I teach over at Pace University, and we don't have, and they don't close the school. They close the campus. But if it's snowing or whatever, as a professor, certainly if I have an issue, I can cancel class if need be. But there are no snow days anymore because, now we have the technology to deal with this. So this is really going to redefine everything about school, including school refusal. Finally, we have the kids who are refusing school, but sort of not really. So cameras and sound off. Now, different teachers have different opinions about this. And if we have some time at the end, I'm hoping that we can kind of get into a little discussion about how those of you who are educators, parents, and, anybody, who's joining us today, what your thoughts are about how to handle this. It's tricky because on the one hand, if a kid is doing well and their camera and sound is off virtually, it's kind of like a kid who sits in the back with their head down. Usually teachers will call out that child, but sometimes not. In my own class, I encourage people, because I'm working with grad students, to keep cameras off and sound on. And it certainly does impact my students' grades because participation is part of, the grade, but I'm teaching grad school. So we are going to identify camera and sound off virtually as refusing school because they're refusing to be present, which, like I said, it might not affect the grades, but it certainly is something that we need to kind of process and deal with. Okay, so we're going to spend the bulk of today talking about prevention and intervention, because I'm guessing that's why most of you came here today. because we want to get ahead of this stuff. It is so important to get ahead of this stuff. And just to kind of walk you through what the rest of the presentation is going to be like, we're going to talk about prevention, intervention, and then I'm going to leave a lot of the time at the end for you guys to ask specific questions about specific cases or just general questions. And the way we're going to do that is Kim's going to field the questions. So if you want to put them in the chat, she'll call them out to me so that we only have one person, you know, managing that. Okay. So what do I mean by a prevention protocol? Well, it's very important to talk with teachers to identify students who are concerning. And again, I've worked with kids that have been chronic school refusers for years and years and years, and sometimes in the same district. But if there's not a good handoff, nobody puts the pieces together. And the reason is because we don't walk into school assuming that kids are going to refuse. It just starts to happen. So the key with school refusal is if we can prevent kids from who have a history of this from getting stuck in the same pattern, we can prevent any problems up front. So I really like to put a lot of energy into getting ahead of it. So we want to assess patterns of behavior. So what are those patterns? Well, a history of multiple absences, obviously. You know, regardless of, see, this is tough because many times the absences are excused absences. And with school refusal, we tend to look for non-excused absences. But if you have a child, let's say, who is constantly out because they're sick, we want to assess, are they really physically ill? You know, do they have a chronic illness? Or do they, you know, feel bad and that makes them feel ill and it's not a legitimate illness per se? Now, that being said, I've worked, one of my subspecialties is actually work with chronically ill children. And they are definitely prone to school refusal because it's like a cycle, a loop. They miss school because of their illness. And then when it's time to go back, it's hard to get back in there. So if we can get ahead of this and kind of prepare for them to be in and out, it's really helpful. Obviously, a history of school refusal. I mean, that goes without saying. But again, I know I keep saying this to you guys, but we have to know that they're school refusers, because that's the key. Is that so many times we don't know. I mean, my mind gets blown when I find these cases of kids who haven't been in school for years and years and years consistently. A big red flag is a history of chronic lateness, okay? Certainly, kids who are late a lot, eventually it gets easier and easier not to come in. And finally, obviously, a history of leaving early. So these are the kids who leave early are the ones that will often go to the nurse's office, you know, and say they're sick and beg to have their parents pick them up. You know, if you're a parent of one of these kids, it's heartbreaking because they text, you know, their parents and say, come pick me up. And, you know, the parents feel, you know, this is their child, that they have to come get them because their kid is suffering. Unfortunately, my response to that is I'm really hardcore. And what I tell parents is your kid is in the safest place they can be in. If they're in school, it's a structured environment. So don't respond to the text, which I know may sound brutal, but it's about shaping behavior. And again, we're going to get more into these techniques, but because these kids who leave early end up eventually not coming to school. So what else can we do? Well, we definitely want to reach out to parents of students who we're concerned about, you know, and just check in with the parents and see what you know, their thoughts are. You know, again, my chronically ill kids, I always want to check in with, you know, for so many reasons, but because I know that they're high risk to become school refusers. And we want to work collaboratively with parents, obviously. Many of you out there may be parents, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Nothing's more frustrating than feeling like you're alone in this. And, you know, it's scary for parents because if you are the parent of a school refuser, you've done everything in your power to try to get the child to school, and you can't. It's the most frustrating thing in the world. And you can really feel out there on your own. So if we can collaborate, we make it everybody's, challenge. So this is very important. Once we've identified that a child is high risk for being a school refuser or a school avoidant, we want to assign a point person to meet with the student. So how do you decide who that point person is? Well, it really depends on the school, but the key is that there should be one person who's holding the entire process for each individual child. In many schools, they choose to use the school social worker will be the person. Sometimes the school guidance counselor, but it doesn't have to be. Quite often, the best point person is the person in the school that the child feels the most connected to, most influenced by. So if it's a teacher's assistant sometimes, or even a specific teacher, depending on what grade level the child's at. Obviously, I'm talking if your kid's in middle school, they'll have multiple teachers, and making one of those teachers be the point person. Obviously, the person who's a point person has to agree to sign on. And if they have too much going on, they're not going to be able to participate in the way that we'd like them to. But the key is everyone needs to know who that point person is, especially the child. So if the child doesn't know the point person personally, we want to introduce them to that person and explain to them that they're there to support them. So the next step is that we have to create an individual prevention plan. And this is very child specific. So it's going to be different for each child. And the key to creating an individual plan is figuring out, remember in the beginning, we went through the 4 reasons why kids tend not to go to school. We want to evaluate each one of those areas and figure out what it is that's preventing the child, or that we're worried is going to prevent the child. Because remember, now we're talking about getting ahead of this. So what's prevented the child from coming to school in the past? And it's not brain surgery. The first person to ask is the kid, because they know, especially for my kids who have learning issues, they'll talk about how it's a struggle to come to school, and our school is boring, and they'd rather be at home, or that they feel stupid when they're in school. And obviously, if there's social issues going on, like kids being bullied, again, we can get ahead of this by just talking to the kid first. So what's very important is the relationship between the point person and the individual child, because there has to be a level of trust. So this is very important also. When we're working with parents, and again, some of you out there may be parents, and I hope you agree with this, sometimes we can get caught up in an us and them dynamic, which can be very frustrating. It is the most difficult thing in the world to be a parent of a kid who has a history of school refusal. Okay, so it's very important that we follow these tips to not come off as judgmental. I have sat in, CSE meetings with kids, who are having difficulty, and it's definitely this sense that of us and them, and it's not meant to be. I mean, many of us who are in those meetings, who are in the school, are parents ourselves. It's just that because it's a frustrating situation, we tend to get into a blame mentality, where if somebody did this or that, it would change it. And it's very difficult because we can't control other people's behaviors, meaning the kids sometimes. So we want to emphasize that this is a partnership, and that is so important because the child will feel that. We want to validate the experience that parents are going through. You keep hearing me talk about this because it's heart-wrenching. Parents want their kids to be educated. But sometimes they just get to a point where they don't know what else to do. And finally, this leads me to state procedural concerns carefully, kindly, and calmly. What do I mean by that? I mean that, you know, in cases where there's been continued school refusal, we often get into concerns about neglect, that parents aren't doing their jobs, which might not necessarily be the case. But on the other hand, parents need to understand what the laws are, that kids are required to go to school. And they need to know what the school is required to do if there's a long history of truancy. You know, because most parents don't know that schools can make CPS calls if they believe that you know, the kid is being held back from going to school. What matters here is that you communicate this information, but it has to be carefully, because you don't want to make it an us and them dynamic. We need to work together as a team, but it does need to be communicated, especially in the cases of the situation where the parents are, you know, more liberal about letting their kids stay home because it's helpful for them. A lot of people don't know that they can get in trouble if their kids don't go to school. I'm not saying, you know, that you know, they're going to keep them back just because they don't want to get in trouble, but it's important for them to understand what the laws are. So what about individually? What can a clinician do to prevent this from happening, to prevent the school refusal situation? So again, the first thing is collecting a history of school attendance from the family and the client. Because again, you would be shocked how many times this is not reflected in school records, especially if a kid's moved around a lot, or if a kid has, even if they've come from the same school district, so many times it comes to when they transition from elementary school, for example, to middle school. My experience has been that oftentimes these kids are not identified ahead of time. So I'll have a kid who's having a terrible time in high school, and I talk to the parent and they're like, or even the child, and I find out that they have not been, they had school refusal issues in the past. So again, making sure that that history is collected and passing that history on to the subsequent schools is so important. It has to be documented. You do such a disservice to the next people who are going to take the baton. Even better, at the end of the year, for kids who are moving into, you know, like let's say from elementary to middle school who've had these issues, I recommend that we identify these kids up at the end of the year and then again at the beginning of the year so that there's a proper handoff. So if criteria exists for concern, highlight with the family and the client, for example, identify the area of concern. Because often parents aren't going to put the pieces together because they don't know that, you know, if this criteria exists, that it could mean that the child's gonna have trouble going to school. You know, I think we all, especially when kids are moving up from elementary to middle school to high school, use magical thinking. We sometimes think that issues will just go away, and they don't. So if we can identify the area of concern ahead of time, we can start partnering, okay? You want to do an environmental analysis. And what this means is you identify the processes that may pull for school refusal. As I said before, you know, if you have overwhelmed parents, I mean, during COVID, many of us have been put into the situation, especially if we have younger kids, that we're trying to work from home ourselves, and suddenly we have to be online helping them be in school. You know, and I know more than a few parents through COVID who couldn't sit with their kids. So what happened, but they couldn't lose their jobs. So they couldn't, you know, they were trying to mind their kids in school, but the kids just started not logging on. And they really weren't aware of that until the school finally reached out to them. So this is something that we really want to be aware of, that, you know, are there things in the environment that are going to pull for school refusal? If you in the school, for example, notice that a kid is having trouble getting along with peers, this could be a red flag, and then suddenly starts coming late to school or missing days here and there. These are the type of things that I'm talking about. You want to create a prevention plan. What constitutes a prevention plan? Well, we definitely want the prevention plan to include interaction with that point person, strategies that the kid can use to counteract these feelings. So for example, let's say they're having social issues, talk to the child, work with them to come up with solutions to make them feel more comfortable. Really looking to other people on the team, talking to the teachers, seeing if they have suggestions on what we can do. If we have kids who are having difficult times learning, like ADHD or learning disabilities, what type of services do they have in place? Do we need to reevaluate that? Are they connected to the people giving the services? All things like this are part of the creating the prevention plan. All right. So we're going to go through the techniques now, that treatment techniques. And some of this is going to be a primer. Obviously, some of this, I just want you to kind of know what's out there and what's available, because some of it is not things that you in your role will be able to put into place if you're not a clinician. But it's just important, especially for parents out there and, school officials too, to know what's available. And again, this is in no specific order, but because the comorbidities are so great with school refusal, we always want to look and see if medication management would be helpful. But that's not the first thing we would do. We would try techniques first. But the reason it's at the top of the list is because often we don't connect the school refusal to comorbidities, to depression, to anxiety. Right now, especially in COVID, I'm working with so many kids who are profoundly depressed. The lethargy that's set in is mind-blowing. They can't get out of bed, they can't get up, they can't get motivated. They're just really in a rough place. So definitely consider evaluation for medication management, because really it can set some kids free. Obviously for kids who have OCD, for example, comorbidities like OCD are hard to catch and hard to relate to school refusal. So I've had cases of kids that have intrusive thoughts all day, all night. They have ritualized behaviors. These intrusive thoughts tell them you must knock on the floor 3 times in order to walk out the door. You must do this or that. And if you don't, something bad's going to happen. And they cannot get out of their homes because these thoughts are coming at them so quickly. And nobody even realizes that this is going on until we assess them fully. I've seen medication set these kids free. So definitely, looking at the levels. And at the point that we say medication is warranted is when a situation or a disorder or symptoms, if you will, reach the point where it interrupts with the ability to function on a daily level. That's when we really want to do a management evaluation. And I'm telling you this because I've really seen miracles happen once we put kids on meds. Yes.
Yeah, this is Kim. Well, first of all, I have a question. And I want to know if anybody else has a question before we move forward with that. My question is, now the medications is something that a parent needs to be on board with. So how do school teams tackle this when a parent is not on board with the medication?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So really, with what we want to encourage parents to do is bring their kids to be evaluated for, medication, because a school can't say your kid must be on medication. Obviously, we want a professional to do that. And what really helps is understanding, the benefits of medication, and that falls in the hands of the clinicians and the psychopharmacologists themselves. So, for example, I found in my own practice, a lot of kids, I was just talking before about OCD, and there are certain medications that literally work miracles for kids on OCD. I mean, not really, but the difference is so profound. My experience is that no parent wants their kids to suffer, but if without information, we're scared. So the key is giving people the right information. And when you explain how the medications work, and again, the school officials, I'm not putting this on them to do this, but what can be helpful is to be collaborating, and making sure that school personnel, have a base knowledge of this stuff to support what the parents' concerns may be. Unfortunately, as we all know, you can't make a kid go on medication. In the past, I've worked in cases where kids were so profoundly depressed, suicidal, and that's the only time where, and even then it's, I've had cases where people have called CPS because it was like they felt it was life threatening. But even then, especially for children, it's not likely that the family will be forced, as they shouldn't be, to give their child medication. So the angle is really about relief, that balances off what the concerns may be, if that makes sense. That the relief a child will feel and get from medication can far outweigh the concerns that the parents have. And obviously, we wouldn't put a child on a medication that's not safe. Any other questions at this point?
Okay, we can continue. Everybody continue. There's good stuff in the chat, so everybody continue to add to the chat. Very engaging.
Okay, so systematic desensitization, what does this mean? So there's two types of systematic. Now think back to Psych 101. I'm sure you guys all probably took a psych course at one point. Systematic desensitization comes in two forms. The first is direct exposure, and we're going to talk about what that is. So the best example I can give you is people who are afraid of flying. So a direct exposure technique would be that there are programs set up where the people who are afraid of flying go to a facility, and they go through a step-by-step process of getting on a plane and actually taking a flight. So by systematically exposing them to each step in the process, eventually they end with being in flight. We can do the same thing with school refusal. Unfortunately, in the age of COVID right now, we have to adjust this a little bit, but it's still possible. So what I recommend with a protocol for desensitization for school refusers is, for example, the first time, if you have a kid who's so afraid of going to school, you bring the child to the school when it's not in session, like on a Saturday or something. Again, because of COVID, we have different rules of access than we did before then. So what I'm talking about now would be pre-COVID. I'll get to what we can do during COVID in a second. So what I would recommend is that a parent take the kid to the school, let's say on the weekend, or at the very end of school when there's no one in there, and have them walk around it, okay? The next step in the process would be that they go to maybe a school event, like a basketball game or something. And again, we have to match it to what the concern is, why the child is not going to school. So we always want to go back to those four categories and see. So a kid who just is terrified to go to school, I would, definitely expose them this way. And I would have them go to a school event so that they can be exposed to all the people. Then the next step would be driving up to the school while the school is in session and having them sit in the car, right? Then the next step obviously is going into school and so forth. You get the idea. So it's the basic idea is that we slowly expose. In vivo is what we have to kind of do right now, because that means that we don't actually expose them, but we kind of walk them through it, through imagery, and we talk through the concerns. And during COVID right now, this is the best opportunity we have because we can't go in and out of the schools the way we want to. And it's kind of like a Socratic questioning thing where, you know, you talk through the child, you say to them, all right, visualize that you're at the school and now what's going on. And what you want them to identify is what it feels like for them to be in the school. What are the fears? What are the strategies we can use to get around these things? And that's what helps them. So again, the idea is that it desensitizes them and helps them go to the school. So when I do school plans, I have rules about them. And for example, with school attendance, I want to shape them. And what I mean by that, it's very important to have a school attendance schedule. And you have to remain very rigid with the plan. And what I mean by that is this, the first rule of thumb is you want to get the kids into the school in the morning, okay? Most kids will try and get in later in the day. And I'm going to tell you, 9 out of 10 times, if you do not get the child in the morning, you're going to be banging your head against the wall because they're not going to go in the afternoon. They will beg, borrow, and steal to convince you that they can go in later. And your best bet is always to get them in at the beginning. Sometimes they can't, so we have to think out of the box. But if you can, start by making them attend in the beginning of school. So for example, let's say you're going to start in for a middle school kid, we do it, or high school kid, we do it by periods. You know, you'll be in school period 1, 2, and 3, and then leave after 3. But the rule is if you can stay, great. But here's the thing, you have to remain rigid with the plan. So let's say day 1, the child has to, or an elementary school kid has to stay in school for 2 hours, let's say, or one hour. And after that hour, they can leave. And then day 2, we want to move it forward a little bit, really depending on the kids. Some kids we have to move slower. So some of them we may for 2 days make them be in for an hour. But here's the key. If on day 3, they can't get to school, we don't go back to what day 3's plan is. We go to day 4's plan. Is everyone following what I'm saying? The key is that we want to keep moving forward, because if not, you're going to be stuck on day 3 forever. Little tidbit of information that you're going to remember, I said, hardest day to get kids into school during the week are Tuesdays. Mondays, you can get them in because it's a buildup. You know, they work all hard, you're cheerleading them. Hardest day is Tuesday. And the reason is because they get in Monday, it's exhausting. They do it, it's been a victory, but Tuesday just looks so looming, okay? I guarantee you're gonna remember that I said this. So again, the plan has to be very rigid. We move forward no matter what. Even if the child can't follow through, we still wanna move forward with the plan. So if they don't get in on day 3, we move to day 4, okay? We wanna use reinforcement. Bribes is what I'm talking about. So if you do this, if you go to school, then you get, and it doesn't have to be monetary or, you know, things that cost money. It can be privileges, okay? For my kids who are home gaming all day, obviously it's a no-brainer that they have no access to these things when they're home, okay? But they can earn it if they go to school, right? So we want to use reinforcement. We want to throw a parade when kids get in, because here's the thing. If you can get a kid to be successful once, you can get them to be successful again and again. It's just that first time that makes all the difference. So we want to acknowledge the moves forward, but let's say they have one day where they just can't go in, ignore it. Just keep moving forward, because I'm telling you, it will, if we almost act like it doesn't matter, it changes everything, because you can focus on that success for these kids. And I mean, literally, you throw a parade. So before we get to the techniques, the DBT techniques, I just want to kind of share some stories with you. Sometimes what we have to do is really thinking out of the box. So for example, I was telling you that when I ran the partial programs, we worked out protocols for kids with school refusal. So sometimes I would have kids who would go to school, but they would go to the nurse and spend the day with the nurse because they knew that the parents wouldn't take them home or couldn't take them home. So I had a situation once, this is a true story, where I wanted to get ahead of it. We had a kid who was in the partial program with us and had done really well with us. And what we had done in the partial program is that, because the child did the same thing with us, always wanted to see our nurse. So what we did is we made a scheduled appointment for that child to see the nurse every day. And an amazing thing happened. When it was a routine appointment, as time went on, the child no longer needed to go to see the nurse. In the beginning, they exercised that opportunity, but towards the end, they didn't. So when we sent them back to school, we called the school and we said, you need to make an appointment set up with the nurse. The school said, we can't do that. If we let one kid have a set appointment every day with the nurse, we could have a whole school of people needing an appointment with the nurse, and that would be overwhelming, which I completely heard them and understood. But I knew for this individual child that they needed to have that appointment set up because it was a kid who had somatic complaints. They always felt they would have like panic attacks. They thought they were dying. So we send them back to school. First day, I get a phone call from the school saying that the kid is in the nurse's office, won't leave. What do they do? Can I talk to them? So whatever, they ended up sending the kid home because he was just so overwhelmed. I told them, can we please try my plan, our plan? And they did, and lo and behold, it worked. My point in telling you this story is not that I'm so wonderful. It's that sometimes the most obvious things can make the biggest difference. Because once that child knew that if they needed to go to the nurse, they could. But here's the thing. Let's say you have a kid who doesn't like a certain subject or doesn't feel good about it. Math, not my best subject. So if I'm that kid, I'm going to go to see my point person, guidance counselor, nurse, every time we have math, okay? And again, as schools, we have to see these patterns. We have to start thinking in a different way. So if you make set times where they can meet with the point person and not leave it up to the child, we're much better off, because that way we don't end up in a situation where they're always missing one subject. Because I'm telling you, especially with middle schoolers and elementary school kids too, there's a pattern for the kids who go to school but then avoid once they're there. And you can see it pretty quickly. Sometimes it's again related to a subject or an activity or a special. You know, I've had kids who will do anything to get out of the gym because they have, anxieties about it. And again, what they'll do is they'll say, oh, I have to go to my point person now. So sometimes what schools do in an effort to make kids so comfortable, we are too flexible, okay? I've worked with some schools that have like comfort rooms now and timeout rooms where kids can go in at any time. And for school avoidance, this is not a good idea. We have to keep it rigid because we want to give them a specific time when they can go see these people. Because if you don't, you're going to end up in a situation where the kid is in school, but not really. Because being in the nurse's office all day is really refusing school. So what other techniques?
Jennifer,
So,
can I interject a minute?
yes.
Because we got some questions. There's people,
Sure.
there's some questions about how to engage kids who, because their social group is outside of school, such as being gang involved. And there's another question about kids that become physically aggressive when parents try to take their devices away so that they can get to school. So I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit, starting first with the gang involvement, because that is a seriously strong social group that completely takes over that whole domain and eats up any desire to go to school. So if you could talk a little bit about that in terms of some strategy.
Definitely. So here's the thing. passion is the key. You have to find out what makes that kid tick and find out what makes them want to be motivated, and use that to your advantage. So for a kid, for example, who's gang involved, what we know about what gangs provide for kids is the sense of family, a sense of empowerment. And what we kind of need to do is find ways for kids to feel that way inside the schools. So for example, when I had more aggressive kids or tougher kids in the partial programs, which we definitely did, what I would do is find a role for that person to use to get to those qualities in a positive way. So for example, for high school kids, I would make them, what we used to do is we would do, if there was an altercation in the program, we did peer negotiation. And what I would do is I would purposely pick someone who you wouldn't normally pick to be the peer negotiator. So I'd find the toughest kid who happened not to be involved in that particular altercation and make them conduct, be the leader. And I would help them through it. We had a whole protocol for peer interaction, how to run a negotiation, because I want to empower them in ways that make them feel good, because usually you wouldn't pick the toughest kid. So the key is what makes the kid tick. Do they have a secret passion for music? Okay, let's go that road. Then, make it available to them during the day or hook them up with a music teacher. The thing with the gang kids is we have to engage them. With any kid, we have to find what the passion is and make that a pivotal part of the plan. Often I will have kids who are not so good with kids their own age, but much better with younger kids. So what we will do is make it part of their day where if, like, let's say it's elementary school and it's K through 5, that, if it's a 4th or 5th grader, that they can, we assign time for them to go work with the younger kids. So again, it's finding the passion and working with it to engage the kid in the school. Is this going to work for every kid? No, it's not. It's definitely not. But when you find out what makes them tick, you really can. Regarding what you do about the devices and stuff, that's always a big issue. First of all, you can't just go 0 to 60. What I mean by that is that, if a kid has had access to the devices, you can't just walk in one day and go, I'm taking this away now, and expect them to react okay. Whenever we present a new set of rules and circumstances, we want to work collaboratively with kids. So for example, when I do rules and consequences with families, what I do is I say to the kids, we're going to make up rules and consequences, and we're going to ask your parents to make up the rules and consequences, and then we're going to negotiate. So like with electronics, I say to the kid, what do you think is a fair rule? Now you would be shocked. Kids really do know when they're on it too much, even if they want to be on it. But the point is that we want them to come up with the rules and consequences, and we want to give them advance notice. So it has to be no emotion involved. So if you break the rule, then the consequence automatically happens. So for example, you can't just take away the morning that you want the kid to go to school the electronics. That should have happened beforehand. And that gets into a whole thing about, setting up rules beforehand for, especially, for issues of kids who are addicted to technology, creating opportunities to limit their access. If a kid consistently is that aggressive, then we have something else going on, okay? And we have to face that. If a kid is getting so aggressive and combative every single day and nothing is working, then we need to think about different treatment, because that's telling us that there's other stuff going on. I'm not saying that they're not addicted to technology, but what I'm saying is we should be able to slowly and carefully work collaboratively to, get to the point where the kid can engage appropriately. If a kid is beating up their parents over technology, then that's a danger to self. And then we're talking a whole other approach to treatment. And again, I don't want to make it sound like I'm discounting how hard it is to address these issues, because I know it is. I work with kids like this every day. Is there another question?
Thank you, Jennifer. And then also, there's a question about the barriers that parental follow through poses.
Yeah, that's for sure. And again, that's my whole point about collaborating with the parents, finding out what the parents need, why are there barriers? And, listen, my philosophy is parents do the best that they can. And, especially during COVID, so many people are overwhelmed financially. I mean, people have lost their jobs, they don't have resources. So we want to collaborate so we can find out how we can help the parents and partner with them. Sometimes that means actually working with the families to help get them services, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit.
2, 5, 6, 7.
Which is important. So, really, parents want their kids to do well. I've never met a parent that said, I don't want my child to go to school and learn and be a success. So if they're not able to follow through, we need to find ways to support them, to help them to be able to follow through and provide them with that support and work as a team, because when they feel alone, it's much harder. Okay. And I just think that that's really important. So the reason I threw in the DBT approach is because these are techniques that we can all actually benefit from. I'm not going to sit here and teach you a whole day of DBT. If we had time, I would, but we don't. So I just want to kind of quickly run through some of these techniques because they do answer some of the questions that are being thrown out there. So DBT stands for dialectical behavioral therapy. Basically, it's a brand of treatment that's been highly successful. And some of the concepts are really helpful with school refusal. And the first one is mindfulness. We all throw that word around, but what it really means is getting the kids to stay in the moment and focused. And the reason it's so helpful with school refusal is it's so much of school refusal, so many times it's about anxiety and anticipatory anxiety, worrying about what's coming next. So if we can get kids to learn techniques to stay in the moment, then we teach them and train them to not worry about what's going to happen next and worrying about what's happening in the moment. Validation is huge for parents that we work with, for kids that we work with. And I just want to define what validation is. Validation doesn't mean you're right. Validation means I see where you're coming from. I understand what you mean by that. And that's very important because a lot of times we think it means that we're telling someone they're right. So saying to a parent, I hear you. I get how hard it is to get Johnny to school. Let's kind of figure out what we can do to help you help him. Okay. I talk about distress tolerance because something has happened where we've reached a point, and I call this the trophy syndrome, where like if you play soccer, you get a trophy. It used to be if you won, you had a trophy. And I think what's happened is that we have reached a point with our kids for some reason where we think that we've sent the message that they never should feel any type of stress. And unfortunately, that's not life. So when I work with families and kids, my focus isn't on them feeling good about being in school necessarily. That will come. It's tolerating the distress. It's about using the right words, having the right conversation, setting the bar in a different place. So if you're talking to a family or a child about tolerating going to school, it's different than telling them they're going to love it. We hope that they can get to the point where they love it, but they might not. So again, it's focusing on increasing the tolerance. Okay. Radical acceptance is just the idea that sometimes we have to just radically accept that things are the way they are. We have to go to school. It is what it is. And just that can really free someone sometimes, where you reach that point where it's like, okay, because people are always looking for angles, and sometimes just cutting it and saying, this, you're right. school is hard for you, but you have to go. So let's figure out a way to make it happen. Then we spend less time on the fact of making it so that a child sits there and says school's not hard. Because for some kids, it will always be hard. And I'm not saying that you give in, it's just that it's a good way to validate what kids are feeling. Urge surfing is just the idea that what goes up must come down. And again, I'm telling you this stuff more as to use as vocabulary. So when kids feel anxious about going to school, anxiety reaches a peak and then goes down, always. That's how humans function. That's how our neurons work. We reach a peak and then it drops down, okay? So it's just reminding people that if we ride the wave, eventually what's up will come down. And that's about, again, tolerating the distress. I'm going to skip over interpersonal effectiveness because unfortunately we don't have time today. It's just the idea behind interpersonal effectiveness is the idea that we want to empower kids. We don't want to make it feel like we're putting things at them. We want them to be part of the solution. And what interpersonal effectiveness is about helping kids feel that they can do things and they can speak up for themselves. And that's important with school refusal because of the fact that a lot of times it's the incompetence that results in the school refusal. So part of that is creating an outside support system. And this goes for creating a support system for the parents and the children, okay? So, you know, in New York State, we have different avenues. Those of you who are familiar with services know, may be familiar with them. So system of care, back in the day, we called it network. So system of care meetings is the Office of Mental Health in each of our counties, offers a treasure trove of services, especially in New York State. And it depends on what county you're part of. But a lot of times we're not even aware of the types of programs that they offer. So when we have system of care meetings, this is the idea that we go to the Office of Mental Health and kind of talk with them about individual children and what services could benefit them to help the school and the parents partner. Examples are intensive case management, which is where we assign a case manager to a child. And again, going back to that question about the kid with the electronics who won't, you know, give it up. Often having someone like an intensive case manager part of the picture, that person is an outside case manager who works with the child and the family to work through these issues. They can be really helpful resource. So when schools help and participate in system of care meetings, we can kind of assess what services the county is offering and see if there's anything that would be beneficial for the family. Again, not always, but I want to mention this because we're not always aware of what's available by the state or the county. We get these services in New York State through what's called the CSPO referral. And this is just a referral that a clinician or school personnel fills out to request, you know, we review the individual programs available and you can access them by going on the website of your county and just seeing what's out there for the families and the kids that could support them. And it's just a form that a referral form that you fill out. I put PIN's petition in here because it really depends what county you live in. I am not a big advocate of putting kids who are truant on PIN's petitions because what we're saying is that it's a court issue. A PIN's petition stands for, as many of you probably know, person in need of supervision. And what you're doing is the kids are initially assigned a probation officer, but it's not mandated, it's voluntary. If they've been truant consistently, sometimes they'll take a PIN's petition, which means that they have to meet with this person on a regular basis to, you know, and this person is outside the family monitoring school attendance. Again, I don't love this as a mental health provider because it's going into a different system. We call it PINS diversion initially, And now some of the counties actually have great programs where they've partnered with juvenile justice. I mean, you were talking about the gang members before, where they're putting in programs that don't involve having to put a PINS petition in, and looking at other avenues to engage kids. I throw it out there because you will sometimes hear people say, why can't we just get a PINS on this kid to force them to go to school? And personally, as a clinician, I'm not a big fan of that. So what can we do individually to help these kids? We have to have a toolbox. And there's all different techniques we can use. I know we're getting close to time here, so I want to open it up to you guys. So the good news is that I'm going to run through what each of these things are. And I believe the presentation is going to be available, so you guys can go back and kind of re-listen to what each thing is, so that you can help create your own toolboxes for the kids that you know that are having trouble. So coping cards are exactly what they sound like. Now I use less coping cards and more the note section on kids' phones. And basically that's just a list of all the things that help the child, coping strategies that can help them get through, you know, the distress of going to school. These days, everyone seems to have a smartphone. So I tell the kids in your notes, make a list of all the things that help you. Photos, very, very helpful. Often kids, especially who are dealing with separation anxiety, to have comforting pictures available, pictures of their pets, their parents. It can really help them kind of have a mindful moment and get away from the stress, and just kind of look at photos and, you know, it's a relaxation technique. What I mean by 911 plan is the idea that we have to have a plan in place before kids have panic attacks or start refusing school, so that we're not scrambling around. So what we do is, that's part of the plan that we talked about earlier, just creating a plan up front, so that when it's kind of like an if-then plan, when these things happen, like if a kid, let's say, runs into it, let's say a kid doesn't go to school because of social anxiety, and they have a situation in school where they confront, we get them to school, and then they confront one of those situations, maybe a particular person that they don't get along with or they're afraid of or something. The 911 plan is kind of the plan that's already been put in place that tells them this is what you do. So the concept behind this is, think about it. If you ask any child what they do, if there's a crisis, you know, what 3 numbers do you call? What do they say? 911. So the idea behind it is that we have a plan ahead of time, so the kids don't have to think, oh, what do I do? It's just written down for them. Again, setting time to touch base with the point person is very important. And again, you don't want to do it in a way that would interrupt class. Kid doesn't like math, don't make it during math, for example. As I was saying earlier, capitalize on creativity, promote possibilities through passion. That just means that when we find what makes kids tick and makes them excited about school, you know, about life, we can get them to school. So kids who are really into gaming, for example, how can we incorporate that into school experience for them? I mean, there are possibilities. Maybe it's coming up with their own game that they design and assigning special time with the tech teacher or something. The point is that passion is the key to engage. Feeling and action scale is a communication system, and it's very simple. It's very, very helpful. The idea behind it is that we want to, in order to gauge where kids are at, we want to talk in numbers. And the reason is because numbers are succinct. If Johnny comes home from school and mom asks him, how is school? And he says, okay, mom may run to dad and go, oh no, Johnny had a terrible day. He said school was okay. If Johnny comes home and talks to dad and dad says, how was school? And Johnny says it was okay, dad may run to mom and go, guess what? Great news. Johnny said school was okay. What happened? Two people heard the same word, but interpreted it completely different. When we use a number scale, we can quickly gauge and communicate with our kids how they're feeling. The key to the scale is the action, and that's part of the 911 plan. What can they do that's going to help them feel better? So you see, I filled in 0, great, no action needed. 1, no action needed. 2, we want them to put in the words, maybe it's starting to feel bad. What can they do that's going to self-soothe? And 3, and obviously if a kid tells us they're at a 4 or a 5, we know that they're in crisis. Again, it's succinct. And that's why I like to communicate in numbers, is a very quick way. Even for school personnel, oh, how is Johnny in math? He seems like a 4. I'm really worried. The English teacher chimes in and says, well, he was a 2 in my class. In other words, we're changing the communication so that we can kind of understand what's going on. And the key work for the kid is to come up with the action that will self-soothe and help them tolerate that distress. What are the alternatives when school is not a viable option? IDT, intensive day treatment. Some schools do it in-house, meaning that the program is located in the school building and it's a way for kids to slowly transition. More and more schools are doing that. Some schools through BOCES do it outside so that kids will go to IDT as a transition program time, usually only 30 days after they've missed a lot of school, and slowly get them incorporated. Partial program. Again, I worked in a partial program. What we were able to do in our program was we would have kids alternate days at the end of their stay with us. So this is a subacute program, a program for kids who are in major duress. Not just, school refusal was sometimes what the behavior resulted in, but the reason they were in school refusal was because they were subacute, meaning highly depressed, highly anxious, to the point where they needed a clinical team from 9 to 3. So, for example, at Four Winds, the program runs from 9 to 3, and the kids have a school component. What's great about partial programs is if they're flexible enough, you can do an alternative day program, what I mean by that is that as they come to the end of the program and you want to start transitioning them to school, what we would do is we would have them go to school one day, but then come back to us the next day, like, the last couple of days of the program, so that they could come back and process with us what had happened. And that really was helpful. BOCES offers for kids who just regular school isn't going to work for them. There's some really great therapeutic or alternative day options. Some kids, my older kids who have had school refusal, we've gotten them into BOCES Tech, which it's a structured program, but it's not, you have to demonstrate that you will go attend and participate. It's an experiential program, BOCES Tech, and it's very helpful because it's more hands-on. So for some kids, that's been a great opportunity for school as opposed to traditional school. They do their core classes in the beginning of the day in school, and then they go to BOCES Tech to do the field of interest, and they have all different types of things the kids can do: computers, mechanics, and so on. I'm not a big fan of home tutoring, and the reason is because if we have a kid who's refusing school, we want to get them back. As a temporary option so that they don't miss academics, it's fine, but we don't want it to be consistently. Now, because of COVID, we've seen that there are some kids that thrive with school online. Again, we could argue that they could go to college online, but we want to teach our kids to be able to participate, face-to-face in life. In extreme circumstances, I have seen kids successfully work through homeschooling and online schooling. It's not readily accepted. My guess is after COVID, there's going to be more opportunities for that. But that's extreme cases where we need to get a kid educated. And there's just no other option. Again, I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that these should be the options. I'm just telling you what's out there. Independent schools, basically private schools, are vouchering into different school districts. On occasion, I've had kids voucher into different school districts. Usually that's been because of bullying situations where they needed a fresh start. But unfortunately, these things cost a lot of money. You can't just take your child and put them into any school district that you want to. Usually in the counties, you have to pay for it, unless there's collaborative agreements, and some schools do have collaborative agreements. And finally, again, this is really expensive, so I'm not suggesting that this is something that is the option that should be chosen, but I'm just telling you what's out there. I've had kids go to wilderness programs, and then they go to therapeutic boarding school after that. And the thing I want to say about this is what we know is that if you're going to put a kid into a wilderness program, you must follow up with the therapeutic boarding. The research on wilderness program alone as an intervention, the long-term effects are nil, meaning that the long-term gains are negligible. The only time it's successful is if it's followed up by a therapeutic boarding school. Now, the state of New York actually, in extreme cases, there are a couple of programs that are approved, but it's not easy to get funding. And again, the only reason I'm highlighting these is most kids, the majority of kids, will never need to go this road. But there are some kids that just cannot do school in a traditional way because of something that's going on. And these are kind of laying out all the options. Okay. Whoa. So now let's go on to some questions. I know it's 11 o'clock, but if some people are willing to stay on with me, I'm more than happy to answer questions.
If anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so hi, my name is Mary Ann Braithwaite. I work for the Office of Mental Health, and we often get calls from schools that are really struggling with, I can't believe my phone is ringing. I apologize. Okay, sorry. And so we'll get calls from schools because they're really struggling with this kind of thing. And so one of the things I'm really consistent about sharing with them is to really do their best to not do things like homeschooling or home tutoring, things like that, because it really does promote staying, at home. And I think sometimes even though schools are trying to do the right thing, they don't really realize that it's not necessarily in the kid's best interest, even though the parent may be promoting that. Sometimes they'll get a letter from a doctor, asking them to do that. And so I was a little surprised when you sort of mentioned this at the end. I know that you said that, these are some options. You're not necessarily advocating for, one of them necessarily, but I guess I'd like you to, if you wouldn't mind, speak a little bit more about why you did include things like home tutoring or home instruction.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you're asking that. I included it because, first of all, I want to be very clear. Unfortunately, I had to run through the end. I am not a proponent of that as being the solution. It is a stopgap measure, okay? Because what happens is, for some kids, if it's going to take longer for us to get them back to school, they lose education, and that makes it even 10 times harder for them to get back. So the only time that, first of all, let me be clear, I don't even recommend home tutoring. We call it home tutoring, but I never recommend that the tutor come to the kid's home. I always recommend that if that's the last effort that we have in order to continue to get the child educated as we're working on a successful plan, is that the child is met at a library or a place that is not home. So I apologize if I gave the impression that I'm for home tutoring, because I'm so against it, I can't even begin to tell you. And I agree. I think sometimes people put their hands up because this is such a frustrating issue and it is so hard. And that's why I spend so much time on the front end talking about developing the plan, putting in the prevention plan, and the point people, because that is the key to
Yes.
preventing this. You know, but I'm glad I'm very thankful that you brought that up, because again, my only reason for saying that we should do home tutoring is because we don't want them to lose education. That being said, there are some school programs out there that they're unfortunately they're private right now. Some of them are now offering scholarship funding, where it's a new approach to learning, where kids go to the school, but they work with individual one-on-one teachers. And so they're not in a traditional classroom, they're with one-on-ones. And then there is social interaction with the rest of the kids, but not in a traditional way. I've had a couple of kids that was the only way we could get them educated, the only way. So again, those are the extreme circumstances, because we have to be honest that not every kid is going to be able to be traditionally educated by the school. It just isn't going to happen. But those cases are few and far between.
Thank you so much. And you know what? I'm so glad you said that about sort of pulling them out of the home. The idea is to sort of, right, get them to sort of move away from the house, even if it's at a library. Some of the schools will do some group work in another building that's not the traditional school building. It might be like an administrative building where they might put like 3 or 4 kids like this that are having some difficulty. And I feel like that's definitely more on the path we want to be on. And I think, as you said, more temporarily, right? So that eventually, you know, the goal would be to sort of have them reintegrate back into the school, but at least having this as a step to sort of get them out of the house. Thank you so much. By the way, I thought your presentation was fantastic. So I
Thank you.
apologize that I sort of started in with, you know, something not as positive. So thank you so
No,
much.
I appreciate it. And the other thing is, I want to talk a little bit about IDTs. I've seen some school districts do amazing things. We used to do IDT, intensive day treatment, outside of the school. But towards Marion, what you said about the idea of doing it in separate school buildings, I've worked with some districts that have done a fabulous job of doing in-school IDT, where the kids we get them back to the building by being in small group settings, and then slowly we transition them in, and it works. So I think the key is that if we can get creative and think out of the box, because it's always been about finances, obviously, money, and it doesn't have to be. If you get really creative and really learn what makes the child tick, we can really come up with innovative ideas to get kids back to school.
Agreed.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Agreed.
Everybody, I mean, I know Jennifer said she'll stay on for a few minutes. In the meantime, I would like for all of you also to, if you want any further information, pop your email in the chat. And then I will get it to Jennifer. And I will also, if there's any other questions you have and you're coming from a county where you are working with families who are not yet connected with any family support program, please, I popped in the chat, Families Together New York State, the website, and we can connect you with a parent advisor who will then also guide you through that process. Okay? So now, are there any other questions? Somebody has what resources are available for 5- and 6-year-old children who are having problems with school avoidance? Was a question.
So again, early intervention, there are early intervention programs. The services available vary by county, so you really have to look at the individual programs. But the best place to start is places like the Office of Mental Health, see what they offer. Intensive case management is very helpful. They can usually connect you to services and stuff like that. But there's definitely stuff out there for the little ones, because that's where it starts. There's not enough out for the youngest kids, unfortunately, but there is some stuff. And the one thing I just want to highlight before, in conclusion, is that my big concern, as I said on the front end of this, is that this is just the beginning. When we come out of COVID next year, my concern, Kim and I were talking about this earlier before the presentation started. I'm concerned that we're going to see a huge uptick in school refusers, because there's a lot of kids who are, as I use the term, cocooning, who this has been the greatest thing that ever happened to them. And I just think, my hope is that, we are all having conversations about that before it happens, kind of like our 911 plan, as educators, as parents, as agency workers, to really get ahead of this, because I don't want to be right about this, but I know, looking at the kids I work with already, that it's going to be quite concerning. So just figuring out how we manage, this year and a half of kids not being in traditional schooling to going back.
Definitely. And I think there was a lot in the chat about, being out of the box, and also teams. So this is something that needs to be done collaboratively, always including the parent, as the parent is the expert on their child. They are the voice of their child. And even if they're posing difficulty, we have to remember that there are many unknowns, and each one of us has many layers. So we never know what's going on in the parent's mind. But I always say to parents, schools don't set out to fail your child, and they don't set out to have your child fail. So, for those who work with families and are dealing with this issue, we also have to remember that very seldom even though the behaviors might be showing you otherwise, very seldom are parents, they don't wake up in the morning and say, I don't want my kid to get an education. So
Exactly.
got to find that common ground. And we got to be very person, family, community, and culturally centered in crafting those solutions.
I was wondering if you had a quick moment just to
Jacqueline, go ahead.
Students who don't turn their cameras on, we're really struggling with that in the middle school settings.
Yeah. So what you can do with that is individually reach out to those kids, obviously in middle school in particular, and it's totally the middle schoolers who are like the kings and queens of this. And some of that's just developmental. I think they do it because they can. Some of them are truly anxious, and they just don't want to be on camera. A good way to address this is to personally reach out to them. Obviously not in front of everyone, and say, hey, I just want to check in with you. Are you okay? And kind of really encourage them, and, just say to them, I noticed your camera wasn't on. We miss you. Do you want to talk about that? How can I help you feel more comfortable? That interaction for the majority of kids will be enough to get them to turn it on. Now, some of them just won't, whether it's opposition or overwhelming anxiety. And at that point, you have to kind of decide what you want to do. I mean, with those kids, if they're doing the work, and just so you know, I teach grad school, and I did have one or two situations like that. Like I said earlier on, the way I dealt with it is it was participation in class. I mean, I obviously reached out to the people, but, and which in most cases was very successful. So I think, just talking to them individually. And if the whole class, some of it's also group think. So if like the group leaders don't turn it on, the unofficial leaders is what we talk about, because there's always unofficial leaders, the rest of the class won't either. So in those scenarios is if you know who the unofficial leaders are, and what I mean is the kids who kind of everyone else follows, reach out to them first and implore them for help. Say, hey, I could really use your help. I know, you do a really good job with, the other kids. Can you help me get people to turn on, what do you think I should do to get kids to turn on the cameras? And you'll see that if you can sway those unofficial leaders, often the whole class will go. And that's in any setting.
I'm thinking more like with the desensitization, because we've done the point person, we've done the action plan, we have camera facing the ceiling, all of those things, and we are still struggling with we have a large portion of children in this 6 through 8 middle school that are very anxious about having their voice on the computer and having their face on the camera, just they've disappeared on us. So working with the families, trying, I love the ideas of, working them slowly in if they were here, but working them slowly in if we can't get to them. That's where we're really running up against a brick wall.
What do you mean you can't get to them?
They're at grandma's and they forgot the Chromebook.
Yeah, gotcha.
Call mom and dad, and they were having internet problems that day, or we have no access to the student, where if they were here and not participating, we could do things, or if the parent was driving them up, we could meet them out at the car, or slowly bring them in. But with not having that access, we are really running up against, what do you do next?
Yeah, and again, some schools are making policies where it's participation. I mean, I know, it's definitely. Again, my strategy is more individual, like reaching out. It takes time though, and teachers today you're also overworked. It's ridiculous. I applaud anyone who's an educator right now, because this has been the biggest challenge ever. I mean, suddenly you're said, teach this way. I've had the experience myself, so I know. But that age group is particularly difficult. So maybe, obviously putting out blanket letters, just requesting that parents help, get the cameras on and stuff, can certainly, make it like policy. There's a lot of arguments, and I sat in a faculty meeting at my own university about whether people should have to put their cameras on. And it caused a heated argument. Because people have very mixed views about it. Some people think it's a matter of respect, and kids who don't do it are just being oppositional and defiant, or, and I'm talking about adult college students. But especially for that middle school age, I think if you can get the majority to do it, and that's the key, then most of them will follow. There's always going to be one or two, and those you can pull in by just getting to them individually, and some of them you won't be able to. It's just the way it is, unfortunately. It's the kid who puts his head down in the back of the classroom.
Exactly. I know we have Katie, and somebody's who's from 91757.
Hi, I can ask my question. I do have to run, so sorry to interrupt. I had written in the chat about pins, and I'm working with 2 children, youth on my caseload who are on pins right now, and have both been on it before, and it wasn't helpful. So basically, I just am recently starting to work with these children, and I came into the case, when these issues with school have already been well established, and it's nothing new. So pins, as we talked about a little in the chat, it's something that's not seen as effective as it used to be. I know we can't really get into it too deeply here, but I was wondering if there are any resources that you would suggest, Jennifer, to look into regarding the change in pins in legislation, and how the juvenile justice system has changed. Anything you would suggest?
Well, it really depends on the counties. The move generally has been, again, it's a financial thing, because and it ebbs and flows. And what I mean by that is that, there are some great programs that have come and then unfortunately sunk because of finances, that were focused on the PINS population, but not just truancy, and trying to divert them to mental health. And again, it's been like a movable feast from county to county. Some programs being successful, some not so. I am always a believer in starting with the Office of Mental Health. In some counties, you can't get a PINS unless somebody basically stole a car and they can't prove it, almost. I mean, I'm being a little exaggerative, but the reason is because of the resources, they just don't have the manpower to be pulling those issues in. So again, I like to think of it as alternative. I think, what can we do differently through mental health instead of focusing on it as a truancy issue, as a behavioral issue? Because usually at the bottom of it is some sort of mental health thing. I mean, that's been my experience.
Yeah, unfortunately,
you
both of these kids are already connected with mental health services we're located in the Capital District, so like Albany, Rensselaer County.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, it's just something that I've seen, this cycle of being on PINs, but nothing really being able to be done by the PINs officer themselves, other than check in with the child, make sure they're at school. So it's just,
I mean, that's when I want to have a system of care meeting to lay down what all the services are and why are the services that the kids have, why aren't they working? Do you know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's like a collaborative group. We all have to get together and problem solve this.
Yeah,
we
try.
No, I'm sure you guys do with very little resources. I applaud you. I mean that seriously. But because I hate PINs. I think the label it puts on people is that you're a criminal, and that's not a good way for a kid to come up.
Yeah, it seems like it's often a kind of a last resort thing. Like we've tried therapy, therapeutic intervention, parent.
The thing that I have a problem.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, unfortunately, we're not going to get every kid, unfortunately. And I hate to say that because I'm not a believer in giving up, but there are tough cases out there that there aren't, the hope is that if we all just continue to collaborate and figure out a way to engage the kids, then we'll save them. But it's tough.
Yeah. Some kids don't talk. They will, no matter how you try to engage them, they just will not communicate. And so that's a big issue I've come up against too. But I appreciate this. This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Well, one thing I just want to say to you, Katie, is the kids who don't talk, one day you're going to run into them and they're going to tell you what a big difference you made, because there are a lot of times where they're just absorbing and you think it doesn't make a difference, but somewhere down the line it does. I promise you, I've seen that.
Well, that's reassuring. Thank you. You feel like you're talking at these people, like just talking at them sometimes. So
yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? We ran 20 minutes over, which it could be a bad thing, but in this case it's an awesome thing because we ran over questions and dialogue and interest.
I have a quick question regarding you were talking about wilderness programs, and I know that's just kind of like a kind of outlandish for most kids in most situations.
Yeah.
But right now I'm working with kids. He's 15 and he's in foster care, and he's been in and out of multiple foster homes. He had family foster care rejects him living with them, and he's an angry kid. He's falling into some gang influence, and his the foster care agency that's working with him is not doing a lot to support him, and he's avoiding school. He's and has no like cognitive limitations or anything. What I'm wondering is, he's actually open to the idea of something almost like equine therapy or like a wilderness program or something where he can actually just like kind of, be physical and be positive and hopefully have positive male and female role models around him. Then I'm wondering if you guys have any ideas of programs within New York that I might be able to negotiate with, the foster care system to possibly allow, because he's threatening to run away right now. He's being removed from this home he's in that he's been with for 3 years, and he's threatening to run away. And I'm just really concerned we're going to lose him. He's a smart kid. So just kind of an open question for you guys about that, if you have any suggestions.
Where are you located?
He's in Brooklyn.
Oh, he's in Brooklyn. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, the big,
There is a program is called Fair Futures Coalition. Check the website. It's for children who are in the foster care system. So check them out. They have coaching until they are about 21 or 25. So that's a good program. Check it out. Fair Futures Coalition.
And then Gallup, New York, which Marcy, thank you, put in the chat. I don't know if it's Gallup, New York and Queens, because I know my son attended some equine therapy, 2 locations, but that one's in the Upper Bronx because he attended in the Bronx, Van Cortlandt Park equine program, and another program in Queens, New York, which I can't remember. So any New York City folks, if you can remember, drop it in the chat.
I've had rare occasions, you know, it's a funding issue, obviously. So I know that on rare occasions, there are some programs that are on the approved list. I think there's one wilderness program, but because of COVID, it wasn't running this year, I think. That's on the approved list, but the hardest part is getting them, just because it's on the approved list doesn't mean it's going to be paid for. So, you know, that's why I don't talk about it that much, because it's so expensive to get into these programs.
It is,
But there are,
if you have a waiver, if the child has Medicaid, and especially if they've gone through OPWDD, or if they have Medicaid and are receiving services, it's usually a good justification can be written by the child's doctor. And especially if it's equine therapy, you also will have an LCSW usually running that component. So they can help you fight and push. I know I have Robin Richards, Zabo here on this webinar, and Robin has been successful in setting up equine therapy in her region, right, Robin? Except for you're muted. Unmute, Robin.
In this region, not on the IEP, but down towards where you all in New York City, it can be written right on the IEP for equine therapy. And I know Winslow Riding Program had provided that. Here, it would have to be something just as an outsource for that parents do. Have seen it therapeutically, but not anything that's related to the IEP.
So you might have success further south with that, because I was successful in getting that on 2 IEPs within the 5 boroughs.
Really appreciate all the suggestions. Thanks so much. It's a good start, at least.
Hi, Brian. This is Marianne again. I saw that you added something in the chat about a question about a youngster who you think might have some sort of a psychotic disorder.
Yeah. Yep, that was mine as well.
Yeah, just check out On Track New York. You guys should have something in New York. Yeah, in New York City, you guys should definitely have that. I'm from Long Island, so our programs wouldn't necessarily be the ones for you, but you know, you can reach out to, just Google it. I'm sure that you'd be able to find something in the city.
it's through Columbia Presbyterian in the city.
Thank you. Yes, great.
Thanks again.
Awesome. Are there any other questions before we leave? We've got 3 or 4 minutes. When I gotta go, everybody's gotta go. Any other questions? Going 1, 2, 3 times. Everybody will be receiving a certificate of attendance who did attend today, and we will be sending out the recording. Okay. And I encourage you to share that recording with your school teams if you're working within the school. For those individuals who are teaching right now and couldn't make it, please share that with them as well. And this training will be offered again early 2021. So feel free to come back and open up a dialogue.
Will the PowerPoint also be shared as well with the recording?
We're not sharing the PowerPoint at this time, but we will be sharing the recording.
Okay.
And we will be sharing some materials related to the PowerPoint as well in early 2021 for both parents and for school teams and clinicians, okay?
Thank you.
I want everybody to have a happy, safe, and blessed holiday and new year. And I look forward to seeing you all again in 2021 for come back to you. Can never get enough of this. Definitely can never get enough of this because it's an issue that is not going away anytime soon. All right, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.